My name is Ross Wilson. I'm lecturer in criticism in the Faculty of English at the University of Cambridge, and I'm a fellow of Trinity College. This is a series of lectures about Romanticism, and we're going to begin by thinking about Romanticism and genre. It might be useful to start by thinking about what genre is, and we can think about this in a number of ways. Genres are the categories into which certain literary works fit. They're the sets of expectations and conventions that govern individual literary works. So, for instance, the novel is a pretty large genre, but we could also think of comedy or pastoral, or even something like the limerick as a genre in this way, and that all these things are expectations and patterns that fit certain works in different ways. Now, why should we start thinking about Romanticism by thinking about genre? Well, let's think about the ways in which we chop up literary history and give different periods different labels. We could think about the medieval period, the Renaissance period, Augustan literature, Victorian literature, or modern and postmodern literature and art as well. Now, each of those designations is, in a different way, a kind of historical designation. Some of them are named after monarchs, so the Victorian period, some of them after ways of kind of carving up religious history, the medieval period, and so on. But Romanticism is different. It is not named after a king or queen or other historical designation, but rather after a genre of literature, the Romance. Now, what is the Romance? The Romance, in many ways, was a genre that had its origin in the Middle Ages, and there are a number of ways to describe it, but broadly speaking, we might think of it as a fantastical tale, often involving a quest or a saga of some sort, often with elements of folklore and the fantastical and magic, and so on. Now, one early way of characterising Romanticism was to think of it simply as a revival of the Romance tradition, after it had been suspect and depreciated somewhat during the 18th century. The 18th century is often characterised, caricatured, some might say, as being much more suspicious of all those things that characterise the Romance as a genre, of folklore, of magic, of flights of fancy and the improbable, and so on. So Romanticism involves a revival of the Romance in particular and of these characteristics. Now, we might take this further to think about the complexity of genre in the Romantic period. Because on the one hand, Romanticism has come to be associated with precisely a rejection of genre, with a rejection of sets of expectations, of rules, if you like, for writing works of literature in certain ways, and of convention. Romanticism rejects convention and conformity in favour of expression, of originality, of genius, and of the personality, as it were, of the poet. The critic, for instance, Barry Cornwall, that was a pseudonym for Bryan Procter, who was a contemporary of Byron's, wrote in an essay of 1825 on English poetry that genre really didn't matter. He said, "It is not very material, we think, that a poem should be built up according to rules, many of which resulted in the caprice of former poets, nor whether it be called an epic or a romance, an epistle or a dirge, an epitaph, an ode, an elegy, a sonnet, or otherwise." So, for Cornwall, all of these things are neither here nor there. The titles of poems and the generic labels that they have don't matter, according to Cornwall, and genre, therefore, in itself is indifferent, really, to the task and aims of poetry. It is a caprice. This is an important word, and we'll come back to it in one of our later sections in thinking about Wordsworth's preface, where he talks about the capricious habits of former poets. And Cornwall here in 1825 is echoing Wordsworth, I think. So there's that position, which is that Romanticism involves a rejection of genre, despite in many ways being named after one. On the other hand, some of the greatest achievements of Romanticism as a movement consist in the recovery of neglected genres and forms. We've already talked a little bit about the Romance, and it's certainly true that a lot of Romantic poets self-consciously wrote things called romances and recovered medieval and Renaissance romances as well, and were influenced by them. Keats, for instance, is a very important figure in that regard. They also recovered and revived the sonnet, which had fallen very much into abeyance in the 18th century. So figures like Mary Robinson, Charlotte Smith, John Keats, William Wordsworth, and Percy Shelley all revived the sonnet, and the sonnet was a very important feature of their poetic practice, and they experimented with it a great deal. And they wanted to recover a lot of writers whose sonnets were central to them. So Shakespeare, for instance, Milton, Spenser, and others as well. The Romantic period also sees the development in new directions of genres, and indeed the invention of genres that had been really neglected or not fully developed in previous literature. Perhaps above all, we might point to the autobiography. We could think of a long list here of Rousseau's Confessions, Hazlitt's Liber Amoris, both very personally revealing books, those. Samuel Taylor Coleridge's great work of literary criticism takes the form of autobiography, his Biographia Literaria. And Oluda Equiano's interesting narrative of his own life is a really vitally important work in the tradition of the emergence of autobiography, and also an important document in the history of slavery. There are other genres as well that really emerge in the Romantic period. So the historical novel is one of these. So Walter Scott is perhaps paramount in the development of the historical novel at this period, another generic innovation. Scott is also key to the revival of another poetic form, a popular poetic form at this period, the ballad. Scott collected ballads of the Scottish border, the minstrelsy of the Scottish border in 1802, developing a number of tendencies from slightly earlier in the 18th century. So Bishop Percy's Relics of 1765, which attempted to collect a lot of popular folkloric poetry. Again, ballads were the form that many of those took. And this interest in the ballad, this interest in popular poetry influenced a lot of the major achievements of the Romantic period, including Thomas Chatterton's forgeries under the name of Thomas Rowley of supposedly medieval ballads in 1777, and perhaps the paramount achievement in this form, Wordsworth and Coleridge's lyrical ballads 1798 and revised thereafter. So what we can see, I think, from this consideration of Romanticism and genre, and this will be true, I think, of many of our considerations of Romanticism and a number of different topics, is that it's a very complex period. On the one hand, is named after a genre, and generic innovation and recovery is absolutely central to it. On the other hand, suppression and rejection and suspicion of genre in favour of originality, expression, the expression of personality is vital to it as well. So Romanticism looks both ways when it comes to the question of genre.